Most people think early Christianity came to us in one clean, settled form. 4 Gospels, one storyline, one accepted picture of God, Jesus, salvation, all of it. But what if that was never true? What if, right next to the Christianity that survived, there was another version that said the creator of this world was not the highest God at all, that the material world itself was a kind of trap, and that Jesus did not come mainly to die for your sins, but to wake you up. And once you really sit with that, the whole thing starts to feel less like a side note and more like a buried alternate map of reality. That's where this gets strange, because the texts that say these things were not just weird fan theories floating around the edges. Some of them were ancient, detailed, widely circulated, and serious enough to terrify the people trying to define what Christianity was supposed to be. And if you're into deep dives like this, subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of rabbit hole where one hidden layer leads to 10 more. What makes this matter is that this is not just about old books and dusty arguments. This is about who gets to define truth. It's about whether salvation comes through faith, obedience, and church authority, or through direct inner knowledge. It's about whether this world is fundamentally good, or whether something is deeply off about it. And honestly, that question lands a little too hard even now, because a lot of people already live with this feeling that something in reality is wrong, that the surface story can't be the whole story. That's part of why Gnosticism still grabs people. It doesn't just offer strange information, it offers a total reversal. So to understand where these forbidden writings came from, you have to go back to the earliest days after Jesus. In the years after the crucifixion, communities of his followers spread across the Mediterranean. The people who had actually known him were aging and dying, and with them, first-hand memories were fading. So early believers started writing things down. Some of those writings became the 4 canonical Gospels we know now: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These became the main sources for the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, especially for people who had never met him. But they were not the only stories in circulation. Other texts appeared too: secret teachings, hidden sayings, alternative accounts that claimed Jesus had given deeper truths to an inner circle. These are what we now call the Gnostic Gospels. The problem is, for a long time, people knew these books had once existed, but they did not really know what was in them. They were treated almost like ghosts in the historical record, condemned by early church writers, but mostly lost. And then, in 1945, the desert gave some of them back. Near Nag Hammadi in Egypt, a farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman was digging for fertilizer near some cliffs when he found a sealed red earthenware jar. He broke it open, probably hoping for treasure, and instead found 12 leather-bound books and part of a 13th. They were written in Coptic, not some obvious language he could read, and apparently no one around him understood what they really were. One story says his mother even used part of one manuscript as fire fuel, which is just painful to think about. Somehow, enough survived. The books drifted through the black market. One codex ended up at the Carl Jung Institute in Zurich as a birthday gift for Jung, and over time the manuscripts were studied, translated, and reunited with the others in Egyptian possession. By the 1960s, scholars finally had access to what was basically a lost library of Gnostic writings. And what they found was not just more Christianity. It was a different, spiritual universe. If you want to understand that universe, the best place to start is with one of the most important texts from Nag Hammadi, the Apocryphon of John. This is where things stop being mildly interesting and start becoming completely upside down. Because this text retells creation itself. It loosely follows Genesis, but with one huge twist. What if the Creator God is not the true God? What if the being who made the material world is actually ignorant, arrogant, even evil? That sounds extreme until you remember how often people have struggled with the God of the Old Testament. Floods, plagues, slaughter, wrath. The Gnostics looked at that problem and basically said, maybe the simplest answer is the shocking one. Maybe the highest God and the Creator God are not the same being. In Gnostic thought, above everything is the great invisible spirit, a pure, transcendent source beyond the universe. From that source emerges Barbelo, often described as a kind of first emanation, the mother of all creation. Then come the eons, divine emanations or aspects of the ultimate reality, all dwelling in a perfect fullness called the pleroma. The last of these aeons is Sophia, wisdom. Sophia wants to create on her own, without proper consent from the divine order, and what she brings forth is flawed. That being is Yaldabaoth, the demiurge. And this is one of those moments where I kind of have to stop and admit, the imagery here is wild in the best way. He's described as this monstrous, twisted figure, lion-faced, serpent-bodied, eyes like lightning, cast out from the divine realm because he is too impure to remain there. Down in the darkness, he becomes convinced he is the highest God. Out of pride, he makes the physical cosmos and appoints archons, ruler beings, to govern it under him. But his creation is empty. So he steals a spark of divine light and places it into Adam. That spark is the real treasure in Gnostic thought. Human beings are trapped in matter, yes, but inside them is something not made by this world. Something from beyond it. That's why Yaldabaoth fears humanity. If humans realize what they really are, his control weakens, so he places Adam in a garden of distractions. Sophia, grieving her mistake, tries to help. Eve becomes part of that rescue, and the fruit of knowledge becomes not the cause of the fall, but the beginning of awakening. That changes everything. In this reading, the serpent is not simply the villain, knowledge is not the problem, and expulsion from the garden is not just punishment. It is part of a larger war over consciousness. Humanity then lives in ignorance, trapped under false worship, until a savior comes to reveal the truth and show the way back to the pleroma. That is the Gnostic answer to evil. Not, God works in mysterious ways. More like, you're living inside the damaged work of a lesser power, and the point is to wake up. And once that framework is in place, Jesus looks very different. In Gnosticism, Jesus is not mainly the sacrificial victim of orthodox theology. He is the revealer, the one who comes from beyond the world system to expose it. Honestly, the matrix comparison people make is not even forced. It fits almost too well. The world is a prison you mistake for reality. A messenger shows up and tells you your true origin is somewhere else. That is very close to how many Gnostic texts present Jesus. The Gospel of Thomas is a perfect example. Unlike the canonical Gospels, it has no narrative, no nativity, no miracles as a story arc, no crucifixion, no resurrection sequence. It is just 114 sayings attributed to the living Jesus, and the opening promise is intense. Whoever finds the meaning of these sayings will not taste death. Scholars noticed that nearly 2/3 of the sayings overlap in some way with material from the New Testament, but not in a way that looks like simple copying. That has led some to wonder whether Thomas may preserve very early traditions, maybe even independent oral teachings. But then there are the sayings that appear nowhere else, and some of them are deeply cryptic. Not gentle Sunday school material, more like lines that feel designed to make you sit in silence for an hour and question your whole brain. Thomas presents Jesus less as a redeemer through death and resurrection, and more as a teacher of hidden reality. One saying hints that humans come from the light itself, which sounds harmless until you place it next to Gnostic cosmology and realize it points toward the divine spark idea. We are from beyond this world. We forgot. We need to remember. That kind of thing was enough to make Thomas feel dangerous to the emerging Orthodox Church. Because once salvation becomes awakening rather than obedience, a lot of institutional power starts looking shaky. And then there is the Gospel of Judas, which somehow manages to be even more provocative. In the canonical story, Judas Iscariot is the betrayer, the villain, the cautionary tale. But in this text, he is the only disciple who actually understands Jesus. Jesus laughs at the other disciples for their ignorance and superstition, while Judas recognizes where Jesus truly comes from the immortal realm associated with Barbello. Jesus then pulls him aside and reveals the deeper structure of the cosmos, the corruption of the material world, and the divine destiny beyond it. Then comes the bombshell. Judas is asked to betray him. "You will sacrifice the man that clothes me." In other words, Judas is not destroying Jesus, he is helping release him from the flesh. When this text became public, it blew up for obvious reasons. Was Judas secretly the faithful one? Probably not as history, since the text is late, likely from the 4th century, long after the canonical Gospels. But as a window into Gnostic struggle, it is fascinating. You can feel a community trying to reclaim the most hated figure in the story and flip the moral center of the whole thing. And I get why people react strongly to that. It's not just controversial. It feels like someone grabbed the narrative by the spine and snapped it backwards. The Gnostic world also tried to fill gaps in Jesus' life that the canonical texts leave open. The infancy Gospel of Thomas, unrelated to the sayings Gospel, imagines Jesus as a child learning to handle divine power. And honestly, some of these stories are unhinged. Child Jesus gets bumped into, kills the kid, blinds other children who report him, then later reverses the damage after Joseph scolds him. It is part miracle story, part supernatural childhood chaos. You can see exactly why this never made it into the Bible. This is not the serene holy child people wanted. This is something stranger and darker. And yet the text circulated widely, and one famous story from it, Jesus making clay birds and bringing them to life, even echoes in the Quran. Then there is the Gospel of Peter, which includes one of my favorite bizarre details in all apocryphal literature, a talking cross. The resurrected Jesus emerges from the tomb with giant figures, and the cross itself follows behind, then answers a heavenly voice with one word, "Yes." I mean, come on. Whatever else this is, it is not boring. But beyond the weirdness, these texts reveal a real pattern. Gnostic and non-canonical writings kept reshaping Jesus around one core idea. He came to disclose hidden truth, not just to found a religion, but to expose the false reality people were living inside. And then we get to Mary Magdalene, which is where this whole story starts touching nerves that still feel very current. In the New Testament, Mary is one of Jesus's followers and one of the first witnesses to the resurrection. Later tradition, though, blurred her identity with unnamed sinful women and prostitutes, even though the Bible never clearly says that. The Gnostic texts treat her very differently. In the Gospel of Philip, she is called the companion of the Savior. The surviving passage says he loved her more than the other disciples and kissed her on a missing part of the text, which obviously drove endless speculation. Was this romantic? Maybe, maybe not. The word for companion can mean different things, and kissing in ancient Christian contexts could simply be a sign of greeting or spiritual closeness. But whatever the exact relationship was, the text clearly elevates Mary's status. She is not background decoration, she is central. And in the Gospel of Mary, that becomes even clearer. There, Jesus gives Mary teachings about the soul's ascent after death, including the idea that the soul must pass through powers and recite responses, almost like spiritual passwords in hymn form, to reach the highest heaven. The male disciples are upset, jealous, confused that Jesus would reveal such things to a woman. And that detail is huge because it suggests at least some Gnostic circles may have imagined spiritual authority in a way that was less rigidly male than the structures that later hardened in the broader church. At this point, I'm honestly curious what this does to your view of the whole story, because this is usually the part where people split hard. Some hear this and think it sounds profound. Some think it sounds way too far gone. Some feel like it explains something they've felt for years but never had language for. So tell me where you land, because this is exactly where the buried stuff starts hitting personal nerves. And the personal side matters, because Gnosticism was not just a bunch of speculative texts, it was lived. From the writings and the broader early Christian context, it seems many Gnostics practiced forms of asceticism, fasting, celibacy, maybe avoiding meat, distancing themselves from worldly pleasures because the physical world was seen as corrupt, or at least deeply compromised. They likely lived in small communities around teachers, and in some cases out in the Egyptian desert, far from city life, which helps explain why so many texts turned up there. The Gospel of Philip hints at a secret rite called the bridal chamber, which is one of those phrases that sounds straightforward until you realize no one really knows exactly what it involved. The text barely explains it. It says, "The bridal chamber remains hidden, the holy in the holy." Some think it was a ritual of inner union, joining the earthly self with a heavenly counterpart. Those who passed through it were called sons of the bridal chamber and treated as spiritually advanced. There are also strange liturgical texts with long vowel chants, sounds repeated and prolonged to move the practitioner closer to the divine, a little like sacred syllables used in other meditative traditions. And that matters because it reminds us this was not just a philosophy club. It was religion, prayer, ritual, experience, a search for direct contact with something beyond language. Before getting to how all this was pushed out, I want to pause on something that, to me, is maybe the deepest layer here. Because when people hear Gnosticism, they often picture secret books, banned doctrines, weird cosmology, maybe some edgy anti-establishment spirituality. But I think the reason it still feels alive is more human than that. It speaks to a certain kind of experience that a lot of people still have and usually keep to themselves. That feeling that the systems around you are real and yet somehow unreal at the same time. That you're functioning, working, paying bills, scrolling, answering emails, doing what you're supposed to do, but underneath it there is this low, persistent suspicion that something is wrong with the whole setup. Not just politically wrong, not just socially broken, but metaphysically wrong. Like the world is dense in a way your soul was not built for. Like the official explanations never quite reach the thing that actually hurts. And I'm not saying Gnosticism is the answer. I'm saying I understand why it gets under people's skin. It takes alienation seriously. It takes spiritual homesickness seriously. It looks at human existence and says, maybe your restlessness is not a defect. Maybe it is a clue. Maybe the reason so many people feel cut off, numb, manipulated, fragmented, trapped inside identities and systems they did not choose, is not just because modern life is stressful. Maybe there is something ancient in that feeling, this intuition that we have forgotten where we came from, that we are walking around half asleep, that the world keeps offering substitutes, distractions, appetites, ideologies, tribes, content, noise, but never the thing itself. And even if you do not buy the Gnostic myth literally, I think a lot of people hear it and feel the emotional truth of it. The divine spark becomes the part of you that refuses to be flattened. Sophia becomes the memory that something was lost. The demiurge becomes every power that demands your worship while keeping you small, and the call to awaken becomes more than doctrine. It becomes a description of what it feels like to try to stay human in a world that constantly trains you not to be. That, to me, is why these texts are not just relics. They still sound like they are talking to now. So what happened to the Gnostics? Why did Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John survive while Thomas, Mary, and Judas were buried in the sand? The answer is not one dramatic moment, but a long process. In the 2nd century, Christianity was not yet a single, polished system. There was no final New Testament, no universal creed, no settled doctrine of the Trinity, no full consensus on original sin, none of that. There were competing Christian movements trying to define the faith. The communities that became Orthodox clustered around the letters of Paul and the 4 canonical Gospels and shared certain major beliefs, especially that Jesus was divine and that his death and resurrection were central to salvation. The Gnostics, by contrast, pushed secret knowledge and radically different cosmologies. These groups competed for the soul of Christianity, and one of the major figures in that fight was Irenaeus of Lyons. His work against heresies is basically a systematic assault on Gnostic beliefs and texts. He argued that Jesus' message was public, not hidden, and that the most authoritative writings were the oldest and closest to the apostolic tradition. He did not wipe out Gnosticism overnight, but he helped define it as an enemy. And once you do that, once you label one stream truth and the other heresy, the historical tide can move fast. The emerging church had organizational advantages. It was more open, more structured, better able to grow and absorb converts. Gnostic groups, with their secrecy and inward focus, were always at a disadvantage. By the 4th century, they were already declining. Then, Constantine changed the political landscape. Christianity went from persecuted movement to tolerated religion. Then, eventually, the religion of empire. The Council of Nicaea helped define official belief. Later, in 367 AD, Athanasius listed the 27 books of the New Testament exactly as we know them now. By the end of the 4th century, the canon was effectively set, and the Gnostics were pushed even further to the margins. Some communities, like the ones around Nag Hammadi, seem to have copied their books, hidden them, and disappeared from history. And here is the irony that really gets me. The Gnostics lost, but by fighting them, the Orthodox Church defined itself more clearly. In a weird way, the people declared most dangerous helped shape the Christianity that survived. When I read these writings, it really does feel like looking into a parallel universe. Everything is familiar, but turned at a different angle. Jesus is still there, Mary is still there, Judas is still there, Genesis is still there. But the meanings are altered so sharply that the whole structure changes, and maybe that is the real power of the Gnostic Gospels. Not that they give us a secret final answer, but that they prove early Christianity was never one neat, uniform thing. It was a battlefield of interpretations, a struggle over God, reality, the soul, and who had the right to speak for truth. So I want to know what this leaves you feeling. Does this strike you as liberating, disturbing, compelling, absurd, or a little of all of it? Does it feel like buried wisdom or just a fascinating dead end? Let me know in the comments, because with a subject like this, the reaction is part of the story. And if you want more deep dives into the hidden edges of religious history, subscribe. There are a lot more layers where this came from.